On the afternoon of December 5, 1945, at 13 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, 5 Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers lifted off from Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale and turned east over the warm December Atlantic. There were 14 men on board, divided across the 5 aircraft. The flight had been briefed as a routine overwater navigation exercise. The students would practice dead reckoning. They would drop a few practice bombs on the Hens and Chickens shoals, a stretch of shallow water off the northeast end of Grand Bahama. They would fly the legs of a triangle. They would be home before dark. The flight leader was a Marine instructor named Charles Taylor. He had been at the base for about 2 weeks. Earlier in the day, he had asked to be excused from leading this particular flight. There is no record of why. The request was denied. There was no other instructor available. A little before 4 o'clock that afternoon, a senior flight instructor at the base, flying his own training mission elsewhere in the area, heard a transmission come in on the training frequency. The voice was Taylor's. It was calm, but it had the particular flat tone of a man who is trying not to be alarmed. The transmission was fragmentary. The senior instructor wrote it down, and it was later entered into the record by the Navy Board of Inquiry. The transmission said the following: "Both of my compasses are out. I am trying to find Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I am overland. I am sure I am in the Keys, but I don't know how far down." He was not over the Keys. This is the disappearance of Flight 19. This is Volta vanished. By the autumn of 1945, the Second World War was over. The Japanese had surrendered 3 months earlier on the deck of the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The American military was beginning the long contraction back to a peacetime size, but the training pipeline had not yet wound down. Across the southeastern United States, dozens of naval air stations were still putting student pilots through carrier aircraft instruction every day. The aircraft they trained on was, in many cases, the same aircraft they would have flown in combat had the war continued for another year. The Grumman TBM Avenger. The Avenger was a torpedo bomber. It had a single right cyclone radial engine of 1900 horsepower, an internal bomb bay, a glass nose, a top turret with a .50 caliber machine gun, and a ventral tunnel position for a second gunner. It was a heavy aircraft, more than 10,000 pounds empty, more than 17,000 pounds at maximum takeoff weight. It was designed to drop a torpedo against a moving warship, recover, and return to a carrier. It was not designed to ditch in heavy seas, and it sank very fast when it did. The engine was forward of the cockpit and acted as ballast. On contact with water, the nose dropped, the cockpit filled, and the aircraft was usually under the surface within 60 seconds. The base where Flight 19 began was Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale. The station was on the site that is now Fort Lauderdale Hollywood International Airport. In 1945, it was an active operational training command for carrier pilots and aircrew. The training syllabus included a sequence of overwater navigation exercises. The exercise number, the simplest of the series, was called Navigation Problem 1. 3 legs. First leg east, 56 nautical miles, to the Hens and Chickens shoals. Second leg north, 67 nautical miles, along a stretch of empty ocean toward the latitude of Great Stirrup Cay. Third leg southwest, 73 nautical miles back to base. The whole flight was scheduled to last about 2 hours. The 5 aircraft taking off that afternoon were given the call sign Flight 19. The lead aircraft was an Avenger marked Fox Terre 28, flown by Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor, United States Marine Corps. Taylor was 27 years old, a Pacific veteran with 2,500 flight hours, 350 of them in the Avenger. He had transferred from Naval Air Station Miami 2 weeks earlier. His radio man was aviation radio man 3rd Class Walter Reed Parpart Jr. His gunner was George Francis Devlin. The second aircraft, Fox Terre 36, was flown by Captain Edward Joseph Powers Jr. of the Marine Corps. His crew were Staff Sergeant Howell Thompson and Sergeant George Powanisa. The third aircraft, Fox Terre 3, was flown by Ensign Joseph Theodore Bossy of the United States Navy. His crew were Seaman First Class Herman Thalander and Seaman First Class Burt Ballock, Jr. The fourth aircraft, Fox Terre 117, was flown by Captain George William Stivers, Jr., Marine Corps. His crew were Sergeant Robert Gallivan and Private Robert Grubel. The fifth aircraft, Fox Terre 81, was flown by Marine Second Lieutenant Forrest James Gerber. Gerber's regular gunner had asked to be excused that afternoon, and the request was granted. He flew with only one crewman, Private First Class William Lightfoot. The fifth Avenger had only 2 men on board instead of the normal 3. In all 5 aircraft, the total was 14 men. The 5 Avengers took off at 2:10 in the afternoon, on schedule. Weather at the base was scattered showers, ceiling 4,000 feet. Visibility good, surface wind 20 knots from the south. The forecast called for the weather to deteriorate later in the afternoon. The flight climbed to about 5,000 feet and headed east on a magnetic heading of 091. They were aimed at the Hens and Chickens shoals. They reached the shoals at about 2:45. They made low passes and dropped their practice bombs onto the shallow water. This part of the exercise was uneventful. The bombs in the bays were small, 10-pound practice rounds, intended to allow the student pilots to estimate range and bomb path. The crews on the surface aircraft of the day reported nothing unusual. The flight turned north and began the second leg of the triangle, the leg they had practiced in the chart room that morning. Somewhere along the second leg, the flight got lost. The exact moment is not on the record, because Taylor did not break radio silence on the training frequency until after he had become convinced he was in trouble. We know that at the start of the second leg, the flight had a known position, a known heading, and a known time. We know that less than an hour later, when Taylor began transmitting, he had no idea where he was. Between those 2 moments, something went wrong with his navigation. The Navy Board of Inquiry, when it convened in December, concluded that the most likely cause was a failure of Taylor's magnetic compass. The Avenger's compass was a simple liquid-damped magnetic compass mounted in the cockpit. Its accuracy depended on the aircraft being flown level and steady for the reading to be valid. Aerobatic maneuvering or violent turns could cause the compass card to oscillate and to settle at an incorrect reading for several minutes afterwards. The bombing run at the Hens and Chickens shoals involved descending from 5,000 feet to low altitude over the water, pulling up sharply and rejoining formation. There was speculation at the inquiry that Taylor's compass had been thrown by the maneuvering and had settled with a substantial error. There was no way to confirm this in the absence of the aircraft. What Taylor believed when he started transmitting was that he had overshot to the south of his expected position. He believed his flight had drifted southward during the second leg, had crossed Florida without seeing it, and was now over the Florida Keys. The land he was looking at, somewhere below him, through breaks in the cloud, was, he thought, the Keys. From that position, the correct course home would be roughly northwest. He had not drifted south, he had drifted east. The land he was looking at was almost certainly the chain of small Bahamian islands extending northwest from Great Abaco. He was northeast of his last known position, not south of it. The senior flight instructor who heard the first transmission was Lieutenant Robert F. Cox. Cox was a flight instructor at Fort Lauderdale with significant combat experience and a calm radio manner. He came on the same training frequency immediately after Taylor's first call. Cox told Taylor to fly so that the sun was on his left. In December, in the late afternoon, the sun in the Florida latitudes is in the southwest. Flying so that the sun was on the left meant heading roughly north. If Taylor was over the Keys, north would take him up the peninsula to base in 90 minutes. If he was over the Bahamas, north would still take him to a coast eventually, somewhere between Cape Canaveral and Savannah. Either way, flying with the sun on his left was the safe instruction. Taylor responded that he could not. He said the land below him was a chain of islands not connected to anything else. He said this several times in the next hour. He believed he was over the Keys, that flying north would carry him over the Gulf of Mexico, and that this was the last place he wanted to go. This is the central error that destroyed Flight 19. Taylor had inverted his mental map. He thought east was west, and south was north of where he actually was. Every instruction Cox gave him to fly north or to fly west, Taylor reinterpreted as "fly away from the position I think I am in," and acted on the reinterpretation. He kept his flight on a heading that took them further out over open ocean. In the meantime, the student pilots in his flight were arguing on the radio. The training frequency, 4805 kilocycles, was heavily congested that afternoon. Several other aircraft were operating in the area. Radio interference and atmospheric static were heavy. Some of the transmissions are clear in the surviving recordings, and some are unreadable. The clearest student transmission, captured by another nearby training aircraft and entered into the record, was the following: "If we would just fly west, we would get home." The student who said this is not identified by name in the record. It was almost certainly one of Stivers, Powers, Bossy, or Gerber. He said it more than once. He said it to Taylor over the radio, and at one point he said it to the other students in his flight, asking them to break off and fly west on their own. Taylor overruled him. He told the flight to remain together. He said the formation would stay together and would continue to search for landfall. He continued throughout the next 2 hours to direct the flight in headings that were close to east and northeast. Cox tried to get Taylor to switch from the training frequency to the emergency frequency, 3,000 kilocycles, which was monitored continuously by the shore stations. Taylor refused. He said he did not want to lose contact with his flight. Switching frequencies on the Avenger required physically rotating a dial on the radio. A student who got the dial wrong would be off the channel and unable to hear his flight leader. Cox also asked Taylor to activate his identification friend or foe transponder to the emergency setting. The IFF was a beacon that returned a distinct signal to radar operators on shore. Activated, it would have located the Avengers immediately. There is no record that Taylor activated it. The shore radar stations at Fort Lauderdale, Miami, and Banana River began direction-finding bearings on Taylor's transmissions. The technique was simple. Multiple stations, each with a rotating directional antenna, listened to Taylor on the 4805 training frequency. Each station noted the bearing from which the transmission seemed strongest. The bearings were then plotted on a chart, and where they crossed was Taylor's position. The shore stations needed several transmissions to get a clean fix because Taylor was moving and the static was heavy. By around 5:45 in the evening, they had a usable fix. They computed it and broadcast it on every frequency, including the emergency frequency Taylor had refused to switch to. The fix placed Flight 19 approximately 250 nautical miles east of New Smyrna Beach, Florida. The flight was over open Atlantic, well beyond Grand Bahama, in the empty water north of the Bahamas chain. It is not known whether Taylor's aircraft received this fix. He continued to communicate sporadically until about 6:10, but he did not acknowledge it. The Navy board concluded he most likely never received it. At 6:20 in the evening, Taylor was heard giving a final order to his flight. The order, as recorded by the senior instructor and entered into the inquiry record, was the following: "All planes close up tight. We will have to ditch unless landfall. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together." The sun had set at 5:35 Eastern Standard Time. By 6:20, it had been dark for 45 minutes. The weather had deteriorated as forecast. Surface winds were now 25 to 35 knots. The Atlantic east of the Bahamas in early December, with a 30-knot wind, produces wave heights of 7 to 10 feet. The water temperature was about 20 degrees Celsius, 68 Fahrenheit. The air temperature at altitude was below freezing. The Avenger's maximum endurance was about 5 hours under economical cruise. Flight 19 had taken off 4 hours and 20 minutes earlier. They had bombed at the shoals, climbed and descended, zigzagged across 2,000 square miles of ocean at search speed, and had spent the last hour flying east into a building headwind. Their fuel margin was effectively zero. At 36 minutes past 6 in the evening, the last fragmentary transmission from Flight 19 was heard at Fort Lauderdale. The recording is brief and partially unreadable. There is no further transmission after that. The standing order, given by Taylor only 16 minutes earlier, was to ditch together when the first plane dropped below 10 gallons. In a 10-foot Atlantic Sea, in the dark, in the heading wind, 5 Avengers ditching together would have been, even under perfect crew discipline, very nearly unsurvivable. The aircraft was not designed for ocean ditching. It had a manual life raft, an inflatable 2-man raft, stored in a compartment behind the rear gunner's position. Survivors needed to evacuate the aircraft within seconds of impact, find the raft, inflate it, and stay together in the dark. The Navy began searching at first light the next morning. But the disaster of the 5th of December was not over. 27 minutes after Taylor's last transmission, at 27 minutes past 7 in the evening, a Martin PBM-5 Mariner flying boat with Bureau of Aeronautics number 59225 and the radio call sign Training 49 lifted off from Naval Air Station Banana River, Florida. The Mariner had been launched on the standard search and rescue protocol to fly the last known position fix of Flight 19 and to look for any signal, any flare, any debris on the water. There were 13 men aboard the Mariner. The pilot was Lieutenant Walter Gerald Jeffrey. The co-pilot was Lieutenant Harry Gibbs Cone. The remaining 11 men on the aircraft were Lieutenant Roger Allen, Lieutenant Junior Grade Robert P. Cone, Ensign Lloyd Eliasson, Ensign Charles Arsenault, Radio Man Robert Cameron, James Jordan, John Menendez, Philip Neiman, James Osterheld, Donald Peterson, and Alfred Zywicki. The Mariner made one routine radio check-in at 30 minutes past 7. 3 minutes after takeoff, standard altitude, standard heading, searching the area east of New Smyrna Beach. Nothing unusual reported. That was the last transmission ever received from the Mariner. At 10 minutes to 8 in the evening, the SS Gainesmill, a Navy oil tanker moving northeast through the Atlantic, about 30 miles northeast of the Mariner's expected search position, observed an unusual flash in the sky to the south. The deck officer of the watch on the Gainesmill recorded the time as 1950, 10 to 8 in the evening. The log entry described a burst of flame in the sky and an explosion. The flash was followed by what the watch described as a fall of burning material into the sea. The Gainesmill diverted course and proceeded to the position of the observation. They reached it inside an hour. They found an oil slick on the surface of the water, approximately 100 feet long. The sea was rough and the visibility in their searchlights was limited. They did not see any wreckage, any aircraft fragments, or any survivors. They circled the slick for several hours. They could not identify what had burned. The PBM-5 Mariner never returned to Banana River. The 13 men aboard were never seen again. The PBM Mariner, by late 1945, had a known history of fuel vapor problems. Its fuel was stored in tanks integrated into the wing roots. Vapor collected in unventilated spaces above the engines. A spark from an electrical system or static accumulated in flight could ignite it. Several mariners had already been lost to mid-air explosions earlier that year. The aircraft was known among its own crews as a flying gas tank. The Mariner that took off from Banana River had been airborne for 20 minutes when the Gainesmill saw the flash. The Navy Board of Inquiry concluded that the Mariner had almost certainly been destroyed by a mid-air explosion of accumulated fuel vapor in the wing root, a known design defect of the aircraft type. The Mariner was not lost in a mystery. It was lost in a way already documented in earlier Mariner crashes. That does not change the fact that 13 more men were dead. The combined search the next day, and for the next 4 days, was the largest air-sea search in the history of the United States Navy to that date. 300 aircraft were involved, 18 surface ships, including destroyers, cruisers, and tenders. 250,000 square miles of ocean were combed. They found nothing, no wreckage of any of the 6 aircraft. No oil slicks identifiable as belonging to a known aircraft. No life rafts, no bodies, no personal effects, no flight equipment, no instruments. The Atlantic east of Florida is 2,000 to 3,000 meters deep. The continental shelf drops away from the coast within about 50 nautical miles. The water beyond the shelf is too deep for any salvage to have been feasible in 1945. The aircraft and the men had gone to the bottom. In December of 1945, while the war was still being demobilized, 27 men were buried at sea by their own circumstances. None of them were ever recovered. The Navy Board of Inquiry convened at Naval Air Station Banana River on the 7th of December. Captain James Madison Mooneyhan presided. The board took testimony from 56 witnesses over the next several weeks. Senior Flight Instructor Cox testified. The base weather officers testified. The radio operators who had taken the transmissions testified. The Bureau of Aeronautics submitted its own report on the Avenger's compass system. The Naval Aviation Safety Center submitted its report on the Mariner's fuel vapor defect. The board's final report, issued in early 1946, found that the loss was caused by Taylor's disorientation, almost certainly due to a magnetic compass malfunction. His mistaken belief that his flight had overshot to the south of Florida rather than to the east of the Bahamas. His refusal or inability to switch to the emergency radio frequency or activate the IFF, and worsening weather, darkness, and fuel exhaustion over open water. The original wording placed the cause on Lieutenant Taylor. Taylor's mother, Catherine Taylor, refused to accept the finding. She believed her son had been blamed for circumstances beyond his control. She petitioned the Navy formally and gathered support from Taylor's commanding officers. In 1947, the Navy revised its conclusion to read that the cause could not be determined with certainty. The two findings still coexist in the historical record. The man himself, Charles Carroll Taylor, has remained one of the contested figures in American aviation history. He was a Pacific veteran. He had been judged competent. He had asked that morning to be excused from leading the flight, and he had been told there was no one else. The loss of Flight 19 did not become a popular legend until 5 years later. In September of 1950, an Associated Press reporter named Edward Van Winkle Jones wrote a short newspaper item. The item was titled in some papers, "Seas Puzzles Still Baffle Men in Push-Button Age." Jones noted that several aircraft and ships had been lost over the years in the area between Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, and that no satisfactory explanation had been given for some of them. He used Flight 19 as his lead example. He framed the region as a kind of bad luck triangle. In October of 1952, a writer named George X. Sand wrote a longer article in Fate magazine titled "Sea Mystery at Our Back Door." Sand collected a list of disappearances. Flight 19, the naval collier USS Cyclops, which had vanished in March of 1918, with 306 men aboard. 2 British South American Airways flights. He gave the region a geographic name. In 1964, a writer named Vincent Gaddis published an article in Argosy magazine titled "The Deadly Bermuda Triangle." Gaddis is the writer most often credited with the name itself. He explicitly named the region. He gave it boundaries: Miami, Bermuda, Puerto Rico. He laid out a list of disappearances, with Flight 19 as his showpiece. The article was widely reprinted. In 1974, a writer named Charles Berlitz published a book titled The Bermuda Triangle. Berlitz was a linguist and the grandson of the founder of the language school chain. He had previously written books about Atlantis. His book on the triangle sold approximately 20 million copies. It is responsible for most of what the general public believes about the disappearance of Flight 19. In Berlitz's account, the loss of Flight 19 is attributed to supernatural causes. He suggests residual energy from the destruction of Atlantis. He suggests interference from extraterrestrial craft. He suggests time anomalies or dimensional shifts. He invents a final transmission, attributed to Taylor, in which the pilot is said to have reported that the ocean did not look as it should, that everything was wrong, that strange things were happening. No such transmission is in the inquiry record. It is not on any surviving recording. It does not appear to have any source other than Berlitz. In 1975, a research librarian named Lawrence David Kusche published The Bermuda Triangle Mystery Solved. Kusche worked at Arizona State University. He went through each of Berlitz's claimed cases against the original sources, the news clippings, the Lloyd's of London insurance records, the Navy reports, the weather records. He found that most of Berlitz's cases were either not lost in the Triangle, or were lost in conditions that fully explained the loss, or had been recovered with survivors. He found that Lloyd's did not charge a higher insurance premium for ships transiting the Triangle. Kusche's verdict was that the Bermuda Triangle did not exist as a discrete area of unusual loss. The Triangle was a manufactured mystery, built up from selective citation and embellishment. His book sold modestly compared to Berlitz's. The popular belief in the Triangle survived the debunking. It continues to survive. The wreckage of Flight 19 has never been found. This is not for lack of trying. In 1986, a team of divers operating off Fort Lauderdale, supported by the Discovery Channel, located the wreck of a Grumman Avenger sitting upright on the sea floor. The initial assumption was that it was one of the Flight 19 aircraft. Detailed examination of the airframe and serial number identified it as Bureau of Aeronautics number 73209. The aircraft had been lost on a separate training flight in June of 1944, a year and a half before Flight 19. In 1991, a team led by the marine explorer Graham Hawkes located 5 Grumman Avengers lying together on the sea floor off Fort Lauderdale. The discovery was announced internationally. It was assumed to be Flight 19. Within weeks, serial number identification proved that all 5 aircraft were from other incidents, lost separately in 5 different training accidents between 1943 and 1945. That 5 separate aircraft from 5 separate accidents had come to rest within a small area is its own quiet record of what the training pipeline cost. The seafloor off Fort Lauderdale is, in places, an unofficial cemetery of training aircraft. In the years since, occasional sonar surveys, occasional ROV missions, and occasional private expeditions have continued. None of the 6 aircraft of December 5, 1945, have ever been positively identified on the sea floor. Drift models calculated using period-correct wind and current data place the most likely ditching position of Flight 19 somewhere between Grand Bahama and the Abaco Islands, in water 2,000 to 3,000 meters deep. Beyond the practical limit of all but the most expensive deep-sea survey equipment. The Martin Mariner is believed to have gone down approximately 30 miles east of New Smyrna Beach, in water of comparable depth, at the position the Gaines Mill recorded its flash. No wreckage of the Mariner has ever been positively identified. 27 men. Their names appear on the memorial wall of Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale, now closed. Their names appear on the casualty roll of the Marine Corps and the Navy for 1945. Their families were notified by telegram in the second week of December. Some spent the next decades waiting for a sea survey to find their men. None ever did. The popular story of Flight 19 does not match the record, the story that grew in the paperbacks of the 60s and 70s, of a mysterious sea and vanishing instruments, cannot be reconciled with the Navy Board of Inquiry transcripts. The actual story is something else. The actual story is that a magnetic compass failed on the flight leader's aircraft, that the flight leader misread his position by 180 degrees, that the radio frequency he was using was overloaded with static, that he refused to switch to the emergency frequency, that he kept his flight together when the right answer was to break up and let each pilot use his own judgment, that the weather built as forecast, that the sun set on schedule, that the fuel ran out at the predicted time, and that 14 men ditched together in 10-foot December seas over deep ocean in the dark. And the actual story is that a search aircraft of a type already known to explode in flight launched into a darkening sky to look for them, and was destroyed by exactly that kind of explosion within 20 minutes of takeoff. There is no mystery in that. There is, in the ordinary engineering sense, no mystery at all. What there is, instead, is a single afternoon in December of 1945 in which a sequence of routine errors compounded into the loss of 6 aircraft and 27 men in less than 4 hours over warm coastal water. The errors were ordinary. The compass was ordinary. The student pilot's recorded statement, "If we would just fly west, we would get home," was ordinary. The fuel exhaustion was ordinary. The PBM-5 Mariner's wing root explosion was, by 1945, ordinary. The disappearance is what makes the story unusual. There was no return. There was no wreckage. There was no funeral. There was a flash of light to the southeast of an oil tanker and an oil slick on the water, and then nothing. When people remember Flight 19, they remember the mystery. The mystery was added to the story later by writers who needed something to sell. The men themselves did not disappear into a mystery. They disappeared into an ocean. This has been Volta Vanished. I am your narrator. If this story matters to you, the names of the men of Flight 19 and Training 49 are at the bottom of the description. Read them once. Say them aloud if you can. There are few places in the world where these names are spoken anymore. Sleep well if you can.